The morning was hot and still, the kind of Russian summer where sweat sticks to your uniform and the mosquitoes come in clouds. Captain Alexei Minin stood at a crude wooden table, studying a map with the intensity of a man trying to see tomorrow. Around him, officers in rumpled tunics spoke in low, urgent voices. The Germans were 20 kilometers away, maybe closer. Nobody really knew anymore. The Luftwaffe owned the sky. German panzers owned the roads. And Soviet commanders were losing their minds trying to figure out how to stop the bleeding. On that table sat a Mosin-Nagant rifle. Model 1891-30. The same weapon Soviet soldiers had carried through the Russo-Japanese War, the Revolution, the Civil War, and now this nightmare. 5 foot long, chambered in 7.62 x 54R, with a bolt that you had to work with your whole arm to cycle. It was heavy. It was slow to reload. It was, by 1941 standards, archaeologically obsolete. "Gentlemen," the general's adjutant said, his voice cutting through the tension, "we need every man to become a marksman. The Germans will be in our trenches by autumn. We need snipers. Good ones." A younger officer, a lieutenant named Volkov, laughed. Actually laughed. Not from humor, but from the kind of nervous exhaustion that comes when you've been losing a war for weeks. "With that?" He gestured toward the Mosin-Nagant with contempt. "The Mosin is a peasant's gun. You point it and hope. At 200 meters it might hit something. At 1,000 meters? You're throwing bullets at ghosts." The dismissal was so casual, so total, that nobody even argued. The sentiment ran through the Red Army like frostbite. The rifle was old. It was slow. It was, everyone agreed, fundamentally limited by its very design. Commanders wanted modern sniper rifles with high-powered scopes and sophisticated optics. They wanted something that looked like it could perform miracles. What they didn't understand yet was that miracles don't come from the gun. They come from the person behind it. 20 kilometers away, in a farmhouse that had been converted into a makeshift command post, a young woman was having a very different conversation. Her name was Roza Shanina. She was 20 years old, small-framed, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her like a camera that never blinked. She had been a nurse with the Red Army when the Germans invaded. She had watched men die from wounds that could have been prevented with better fire support. She had watched Soviet soldiers pinned down by accurate German fire, helpless and dying because they couldn't shoot back effectively enough. One morning, she walked into the sniper platoon commander's office and asked if she could try. Just try. He almost threw her out. Women didn't become snipers. That wasn't how the Soviet army worked. That wasn't how anything worked. But Roza Shanina was not asking permission. She was announcing a decision. By the following week, she had a rifle in her hands. A Mosin-Nagant Model 1891-30, equipped with a PU scope, a simple but effective Soviet-made optical sight that magnified 3.5 times and wasn't much more sophisticated than a hunting scope. She took it to the range. At 300 meters, she was already more accurate than 90% of the men in her unit. At 500 meters, officers began to realize that they were watching something unusual. At 1,000 meters, people stopped talking and just watched. The shots came with mathematical precision, one after another. The same slight adjustment of her body. The same breath held before the trigger break. The same rhythm. Every fifth shot through the exact center of the target's kill zone. The men around her began to exchange glances. None of them had ever seen anything like this. "Where did you learn to shoot?" the platoon commander asked, genuinely bewildered. "I learned to see," she answered simply. What happened over the next months became the most underestimated military transformation of the entire Eastern Front, a revolution that nobody planned, that contradicted every assumption the Red Army had made about modern warfare, and that would eventually force German commanders to admit they had fundamentally miscalculated the capabilities of their enemy. The story of that transformation cannot be separated from the rifle itself. To understand how the Mosin-Nagant became legendary, you first have to understand what people thought it was, versus what it actually was. The rifle had been designed in 1891 by 3 men, Sergei Mosin, a Russian officer, and 2 Belgian designers named Nagant and Schanar. It was created for an age of cavalry charges and massed linear formations, when battles were won at 200 meters and an army needed rifles that worked in the mud, the cold, and the dirt of Imperial Russia. It was never meant to be a precision instrument. It was meant to be simple, rugged, and unstoppable, a hammer that would work when everything else failed. By 1941, every military theorist in the world had moved on. The Germans had the Kar 98K, which was marginally more modern. The Americans had the M1 Garand, which was semi-automatic and revolutionary. The British had the Lee Enfield, which was faster firing and had a shorter action. By every measure of military orthodoxy, the Mosin-Nagant was behind the curve. But Soviet military theorists had made a crucial error. They had confused the weapon with the user. They had assumed that an old rifle meant an old solution, when in fact an old rifle could perform new miracles in the hands of someone who understood its true nature. Roza Shanina understood that nature. By autumn of 1941, she had 75 confirmed kills. By winter, 150. The kills weren't lucky shots. They weren't accidents. They were the result of a woman who had spent hours, thousands of hours, understanding exactly how a 1891 pattern rifle behaved at distance, how the bullet would drift in the wind, how temperature and humidity would affect bullet drop, and where a man's heart actually was when you were looking at him through a scope from half a mile away. But Roza wasn't alone. Across the Soviet lines, other snipers were emerging from the chaos of the German invasion. Men and women who had picked up Mosin-Nagants stepped up to makeshift ranges and discovered something that would shock the entire world. The rifle, in the right hands, was capable of accurate fire at distances that German officers had dismissed as impossible. Ivan Sidorenko was a peasant from the Ural Mountains. He had hunted his entire life, not for sport, but for food. To Ivan, a rifle wasn't a military weapon. It was the extension of his eye, his arm, his will. When the war came and the Red Army handed him a Mosin-Nagant, he didn't think about whether it was modern. He thought about what it could do. His first confirmed kill came at 1,215 yards. The target was a German officer standing in a communications trench, visible only from the waist up. Ivan had calculated wind drift, bullet drop, and the slight decline of the terrain. One shot. The officer was dead before anyone heard the sound of the rifle. By the end of 1941, Ivan Sidorenko had 104 confirmed kills. By 1943, he had become the stuff of legend, the Red Devil of the Eastern Front, the man who could kill you from so far away that you'd never see him, never hear the shot, would only fall down and wonder, in your last moment of consciousness, where death had come from. And he was doing it with a rifle that military theorists had written off as obsolete. Word of these snipers traveled fast through the Soviet army. Officers began to understand that their dismissal of the Mosin-Nagant had been catastrophically wrong. But more importantly, they began to understand something deeper, that individual excellence could reshape battlefield reality. If one person with a rifle could establish a zone of death that extended 2,000 meters in every direction, then an army of such people wasn't an army at all. It was something far more dangerous. It was a hunting pack. By late 1941, the Red Army had undergone a philosophical shift. They were losing the war strategically, but they were learning something crucial tactically, that they could hurt the enemy in ways the enemy hadn't anticipated. And they decided to systematize it. In November 1941, the Soviet High Command established formal sniper schools. Not just training ranges where men learned to shoot. Actual schools where snipers were taught a complete methodology for operating as independent hunters on a mechanized battlefield. The curriculum would have astonished Western military theorists. There was ballistics, of course, calculations of wind correction, elevation, temperature effects on ammunition. But there was also something far more esoteric. Snipers were taught camouflage so complete that they could lie motionless in a field for 12 hours and watch a German squad walk past 10 meters away without seeing them. They were taught stalking techniques borrowed from hunting. They were taught how to read the landscape, how to identify likely German positions based on terrain, how to predict where officers would stand during attacks, how to position themselves so that their single shot would trigger a chain of events that would paralyze an enemy unit. Roza Shanina attended one of these schools in early 1942. By then, she had 200 confirmed kills. The instructors had no idea what to do with her. She was already better than they were. What happened instead was that Roza became an instructor. She taught young Soviet soldiers, many of them women, because the Red Army had realized that gender mattered far less than skill, how to think like the rifle instead of thinking like the army. The Mosin-Nagant, she would tell her students, standing in the frozen snow with a rifle in her hands, is not a modern rifle. That is correct. It was designed 50 years before you were born. That is also correct. But do you know why that does not matter? She would pause, letting the question hang in the frigid air. Because the rifle does not know it is old. The bullet does not know it is using an old firing system. Gravity does not know whether it was discovered in 1891 or 1941. The wind does not care about the date on your gun. The enemy is just as dead at 2,000 yards whether you killed him with a modern rifle or an ancient one. And the enemy is much more dead if he does not see you coming. This philosophy, that the weapon mattered less than the warrior, that precision and patience could overcome industrial disadvantage, became the foundation of Soviet sniper training. And it worked. It worked so well that by 1942, German commanders were beginning to receive reports that puzzled and terrified them in equal measure. German officers were dying. Not in large numbers. Not from artillery or airstrikes or tank attacks. But from single shots that came from nowhere. One moment a lieutenant was standing in a command trench, the next moment his head was gone. One moment a sergeant was organizing a defensive position, the next moment he was lying in the snow with a hole in his chest. The Germans had snipers too. They were excellent marksmen. But they were operating under a fundamentally different doctrine. German snipers were attached to units. They were tactical weapons. They operated at 1,000 meters or less, supporting specific engagements. Soviet snipers were different. They operated independently. They ranged out to distances that German military theory considered impossible. And they were multiplying. By the middle of 1942, the Red Army had trained over 3,000 snipers. By 1943, over 6,000. By 1944, the number had doubled again. They were deployed across the entire front, and they had a single, unified purpose, to make the Eastern Front a place where death could come from any direction, from any distance, without warning or mercy. German commanders began to understand, slowly and with growing horror, that their assumptions about modern warfare had been wrong. They had believed that industrial capacity and modern tactics would determine the outcome of battles. They had believed that the age of the individual sharpshooter had passed. They had believed that technology had made personal skill irrelevant. All three beliefs were catastrophically incorrect. By the summer of 1943, Roza Shanina was not just a sniper. She was a legend. Soviet soldiers whispered her name the way men whisper about ghosts. There were stories that she could kill a man at 3,000 meters. There were stories that she never missed. There were stories that she could predict where the enemy would move and be waiting in perfect position when they got there. Most of the stories were exaggerations. Most, but not all. In early July 1943, she received orders to deploy to the Kursk salient, a massive bulge in the front line where Soviet intelligence had predicted that the Germans would attempt their largest offensive operation of the entire war. 2 million men would eventually converge on this place. Thousands of tanks would clash in the largest armored engagement in human history. And somewhere in the chaos, a 22-year-old woman with a rifle would become part of something that would reshape how warfare was understood. Roza took up position in a communications trench behind the main Soviet defensive line. Her Mosin-Nagant was equipped with her PU scope. She had approximately 300 rounds of ammunition. She had a spotter, a young sergeant named Victor who had been attached to her for the previous year. Victor's job was to locate targets, calculate wind and distance, and watch for return fire. Roza's job was to kill. The German offensive began on July 5. German artillery opened up before dawn, and the earth itself seemed to shake. Somewhere in the darkness, panzers were rolling forward. Somewhere beyond sight, thousands of men were running toward the Soviet positions. Roza waited. This was the part that most people did not understand about sniping. It was not about action. It was about patience. The most effective snipers were not the best shooters. They were the best waiters. They were the people who could remain motionless for hours, completely invisible, and then, in a single moment of perfect timing, transform the entire battle. As the sun came up, German officers began to appear. They had to. They had to organize the attack. They had to coordinate the tanks. They had to be visible, at least for moments, to be effective. Roza's first shot came at 7:47 a.m. A German major standing in a command trench approximately 1,800 meters away. The scope had been sighted in for that exact distance the night before. The trigger brake was smooth. The bullet, traveling at approximately 2,800 feet per second through air that was cool and relatively still in the early morning, made its journey. It took about 1 second for the bullet to reach the major. In that 1 second, he never knew it was coming. He fell forward into the trench. Dead before his mind could register that he had been shot. This was the moment when the myth became reality. This was the moment when every officer in the German Wehrmacht received, without hearing any specific order, an unspoken message: you are being hunted. You are not safe. Your rank makes you more visible. Your responsibility to lead makes you more vulnerable. And someone, somewhere, has a rifle pointed at you. Over the next 12 days, Roza recorded 43 confirmed kills during the Battle of Kursk. Some of them were at distances that German snipers insisted were impossible. Some of them came from positions so well camouflaged that German search parties never found them. All of them sent the same message through the German lines. But Roza Shanina was not unique. She was not even unusual. She was simply the most visible example of something that was happening all across the Kursk salient. Soviet snipers, operating in coordinated teams, using sophisticated camouflage, armed with Mosin-Nagants that were shooting with impossible accuracy, were establishing what amounted to a complete psychological transformation of the battlefield. German officers began to hesitate. When you had to stand up to organize an attack, and there was a reasonable chance that you would be dead within seconds from a bullet you couldn't hear or see coming, your risk calculations changed. Hesitation spread like infection through the German lines. Attacks that should have been coordinated were delayed. Officers that should have been decisive became cautious. And in a modern mechanized battle, hesitation means failure. The Germans did not lose the Battle of Kursk because of Soviet snipers. They lost it because Soviet armor, artillery, and defensive positions were superior. But the snipers changed the calculus. They made the cost of leadership prohibitively high. They made the German commanders pay for every meter of ground in ways they had not anticipated. When it was over, the Germans had suffered over 200,000 casualties. The Soviet Union had suffered nearly 900,000. By any measure of military accounting, it was a slaughter. But strategically, psychologically, tactically, the Germans had lost. And they knew it. They would never take the initiative on the Eastern Front again. And it had, in part, been accomplished by a rifle that everyone had said was obsolete. By early 1944, Roza Shanina had become the most celebrated sniper in the Soviet Union. Her confirmed kill count had reached 59. She had been awarded the Order of Glory 3 times. Soviet newspapers ran stories about her. Soldiers called her the Lady Death. In an army that desperately needed heroes, she had become one of the few certainties in a world that had become nothing but chaos and death. But fame in wartime carries a price that peacetime soldiers never understand. Every German officer on the Eastern Front now knew her name. They knew that somewhere across the front lines, a young woman with a Mosin-Nagant was hunting them. They knew that if they stood up, if they made themselves visible, if they did the job that required them to be exposed, they might die. They might die to her. German High Command issued orders: find her. Kill her. Make her an example. German snipers began to actively hunt for Roza. They would stake out positions they thought she might use. They would wait for hours, for days, for the single moment when she might reveal herself. It became a war within the war, a personal vendetta between Roza Shanina and the entire German sniper corps. In January 1944, during operations near Vilnius, Roza was moving between positions when a German sniper shot her. The bullet struck her in the leg. It was not a killing shot, but in the frozen Russian winter, 50 kilometers from any adequate medical facility, a serious leg wound might as well have been a death sentence. Her spotter, Victor, carried her. He walked for hours through the snow, carrying a woman bleeding from a serious wound, while German patrols searched for them. He found shelter in a farmer's barn. He bound her wound as best he could with field dressings. He waited for Soviet forces to advance far enough to extract her. When the Red Army finally reached her position, Roza Shanina was in shock from blood loss and cold. She was taken to a field hospital. The doctors told her what she already knew: she would not be shooting again for months. The war would continue without her. But Roza would not stay in the hospital. In March, against medical advice, against orders, against everything that should have kept her safe and recovering, she returned to active duty. Her leg was not fully healed. She was not physically ready. But she was emotionally ready, ready to go back, ready to hunt, ready to find the German sniper who had shot her and end it. She never found him. In the chaos of the Eastern Front in 1944, individual vengeance became impossible. The war was moving too fast now. The Soviets were advancing. The Germans were retreating. The organized, brutal, calculated warfare of 1943 was giving way to something more chaotic and desperate. Roza was transferred to a new position. A new sniper team. New orders. On the night of January 16, 1945, exactly 1 year after she had been shot, she was leading a group of soldiers on a reconnaissance mission when a hidden German machine gun opened fire. The darkness erupted. Roza was hit multiple times. She died in the snow, at age 23, with 59 confirmed kills. Her only burial was the frozen ground and the memory of the men who had known her. When the war ended, the Mosin-Nagant was still being used. Soviet soldiers carried it during the final assault on Berlin. It was there at the end, just as it had been there at the beginning, just as it had been there through every moment of the most brutal conflict in human history. The rifle did not change. It remained exactly what it had always been: simple, reliable, and unspectacular. It was not beautiful. It was not modern. It was not impressive by any standard of military technology. But it was effective. And more importantly, it had proven something that military theorists had desperately wanted to deny. The weapon does not determine the warrior. The warrior determines the weapon. Ivan Sidorenko survived the war. He recorded 346 confirmed kills, the highest of any Soviet sniper. He was made a hero of the Soviet Union. After the war, he lived quietly in the Ural Mountains, the place where he had learned to hunt as a child. He died in 1978, having never sought fame or attention beyond that which had been forced upon him. Roza Shanina died in the snow, never knowing that her name would become immortal in Soviet military history. She died without the recognition that would have been hers if she had survived even one more year. She died when she was 23 years old, having killed more men than most soldiers saw in their entire lives, having changed the course of battles with her skill and courage, and having proven that the rifle she was dismissed for carrying could be the most deadly weapon on the battlefield if placed in the right hands. The Mosin-Nagant went on to be used in conflicts around the world. It was carried in Korea, in Vietnam, in Africa, in the Middle East. It was not the most modern rifle. It was never the most advanced. But it was reliable, and in the hands of someone who understood its capabilities, it was devastatingly accurate. By the end of World War II, the Red Army had trained over 30,000 snipers. Many of them were killed. Many of them survived. All of them operated under a doctrine that had been proven at Stalingrad, at Kursk, at Berlin, and on 1,000 unnamed hills and in 1,000 frozen forests, that a single person with a rifle, with training, with patience, and with skill, could reshape the entire character of modern warfare. German commanders had mocked the Mosin-Nagant. They had dismissed Soviet snipers as irrelevant to modern mechanized combat. They had believed that precision marksmanship was an anachronism, that the future belonged to tanks and artillery and air power, that individual soldiers with rifles were relics of a previous century. They had been catastrophically, fatally wrong. Today, more than 80 years after World War II ended, Soviet sniper doctrine is studied in every advanced military institution on Earth. The techniques that Roza Shanina and Ivan Sidorenko pioneered, camouflage, stalking, patient observation, understanding the psychological dimensions of long-range fire, are taught in the United States Army's sniper school. They are taught in the British SAS sniper courses. They are taught everywhere that serious military instruction happens, because those techniques work. They have been proven to work across decades and across every type of battlefield. But the most important lesson, the lesson that took 3 years of warfare and tens of thousands of deaths to establish, is simpler than any tactic. It is this, that individual excellence can overcome industrial disadvantage. That a weapon that everyone has written off can become legendary in the hands of someone who refuses to accept that verdict. That a rifle designed in 1891 can be more effective in 1943 than weapons that seem more modern and more impressive. The Mosin-Nagant is gone now. Modern snipers use rifles with better optics, faster actions, more precision engineering. There is no question that modern sniper rifles are superior in almost every measurable way. But those modern rifles are not better because they are more advanced. They are better because someone learned the lessons that Roza Shanina and Ivan Sidorenko and thousands of other Soviet snipers taught the world, that the weapon is only the beginning. That training is essential. That patience is power. That understanding the landscape, both the physical terrain and the psychological battlefield, is more important than any piece of equipment. The Mosin-Nagant was mocked for its age, its simplicity, its apparent obsolescence. But it became one of the deadliest weapons of World War II not because the rifle changed, but because the people using it understood something that their critics did not. They understood that the rifle was simply a tool. And in the hands of the right person, no tool is ever truly obsolete. No weapon is ever truly incapable. No tool is ever truly outmoded if it can accomplish the mission better than anything else available. Roza Shanina died at 23 with 59 confirmed kills. She died before she could see how her legacy would echo forward through the decades. She died before she could know that her name would be taught in sniper schools around the world. She died before she could understand that she had been part of something larger than any individual battle or any single war. She had been part of the transformation of warfare itself. And it had all begun with a rifle that everyone had dismissed as impossible. A rifle that had proven that in the hands of someone who refused to accept the limits that others had imposed, the impossible becomes not just possible, but inevitable. The Mosin-Nagant did not become legendary because it changed. It became legendary because the people wielding it understood that the rifle's apparent limitations were not limitations at all. They were simply instructions for how to use it correctly.